Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to The Bunker. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing 40 examples of the Bible getting it wrong about science. Now, I understand many of you watching will want me to get straight to these examples. I understand the impatience. I do, however, need to say a few things before we get started. If you want to skip straight to the examples, you will notice in the description to this video, I've listed them all numerically with timestamps. So if you want to skip this whole preamble part, just go to the description, click on the timestamp that you are interested in. And yes, that's an easy way of skipping the intro, but the intro is needed. I want to make a few disclaimers. Firstly, that it's no easy thing making a list like this, because we're talking about the Bible, a document that can be interpreted any number of ways. And biblical literalists will want to interpret embarrassing verses or verses that contradict science as not being literal but being somehow metaphorical. But I obviously find this approach intellectually dishonest. I think if you're going to take this as the word of God, it needs to make sense, especially when it's making claims of a scientific nature or claims about the natural world. It's not unreasonable to require accuracy from a book that claims authorship by God or by the creator of all things. So I'm going to be listing a number of claims or a number of things that the Bible says where many of you who would make excuses for the Bible would say, oh, that's just poetic or that's just metaphorical. Okay, you're entitled to your view. All I would ask is, because this is quite a long list, we're talking about 40 examples. All I would ask is, how many examples would it take to convince you that the Bible gets it wrong on science? How many times are you going to allow the Bible to get it wrong and still claim authority over your life as the inerrant word of God? If I had a friend who said, Lloyd, I've got a message for you from God and it's in the form of a letter. Do you want to see it? I would obviously say, don't be ridiculous. You're scaring me. Let's get you some help. And they said, no, listen, hear me out. It is from God, this message. And all I ask is that you read the message and judge for yourself whether it's come from God or not. So if I were to do that and I were to read this message, all I would personally need is for the message to say one unscientific thing, one thing that has been proven by science to be wrong. And I would immediately know that, that predictably, this is not a message for me from the Almighty. So I think it's not unreasonable to ask the same thing of the Bible, which claims to be a message from the authority. And as you can see, I'm waving around the Silver Sword, the 2013 edition of the New World Translation, which I will be quoting from in this video because my channel is mostly dealing with Jehovah's Witnesses. However, on one or two occasions, I will also be comparing with the King James Version. So that's another little disclaimer. And finally, I wanted you all to know that this is a Patreon-voted video. Yes, my patrons have asked me to make this video. So if you are a Bible literalist or a Christian fundamentalist and you're annoyed at me for what I'm about to say, don't blame me, blame them. No hard feelings, patrons. Anyway, let's get underway. And I thought the best way to do this would be to show you clips from 3 videos produced by Jehovah's Witnesses, each emphasizing the inerrancy of the Bible when it comes to describing scientific matters.
Some accuse the Bible of being a collection of myths and legends written by well-intentioned humans. By contrast, the Bible says that it is the Word of God who cannot lie. If the Bible was authored by God, it should be like no other book ever written. For example, when it mentions scientific matters, what it says should be in harmony with proved science. During the time when the Bible was written, many people had mistaken ideas about the shape of the earth. A theory written after the Bible was completed was that the universe emerged from a cosmic egg and that the earth is supported by various creatures. In contrast, about the year 1473 BCE, Moses wrote that the earth is suspended upon nothing. And around the year 732 BCE, the prophet Isaiah wrote that the earth is a circle or sphere. These Bible writers contradicted ideas that were popular at the time.
So this clip was taken from a video on the jw.org website titled "How Can We Be Sure the Bible is True?" And it says something that I can agree with. This doesn't happen often in jw.org videos, but we heard there the statement,
if the Bible was authored by God, it should be like no other book ever written. For example, when it mentions scientific matters, what it says should be in harmony with proved science.
That I can agree with, and that's what I was saying earlier. You know, how many errors are we going to allow in a book that claims to have been authored by God when it comes to science, things that God should know about if he has or it has created all things? We then hear an example or a supposed example affirming that the Bible is true on the matter of the shape of the earth. Now, I'm going to revisit this later on in this video. I do just want to flag, however, that it mentions there the verse in Job 26 verse 7. It says that Moses wrote the book of Job, okay, if you say so. And it says that in Job 26 verse 7, the earth is described as hanging on nothing. That's not really accurate. The earth is suspended by gravitational force as it makes its way around the sun, and the sun is itself bound by laws of physics, by gravitational forces in the galaxy. So I don't really subscribe to this idea of the earth hanging on nothing. And I also want you to take a note of where in the Bible this verse is found, the book of Job, because we're going to be consulting other verses from Job that say preposterous things about the earth and about the natural world. And if you are a biblical literalist or a Christian fundamentalist, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, that's just poetry. That's just a beautiful metaphor to describe the natural order. Well, notice how a metaphor or a piece of poetry has been used here in this example where it says the earth hangs on nothing. This is the same book that we're talking about here. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about intellectual dishonesty. I think it's wrong to cherry pick certain verses that sort of sound like they might support science while ignoring a raft of verses that completely fly in the face of science. So I just wanted to make that point. We'll now move on to our next clip.
Scientists estimate that the universe is 14 billion years old. This implies that the universe, including Earth, had a beginning. The Bible agrees. Genesis 1:1 reads, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." The account does not say when or how the universe began. Rather, It focuses on the creative process that took place on Earth over 6 periods of time, which the Bible calls days. Were these 6 24-hour days, as many believe? No. The Hebrew word used in the Bible for day can refer to various lengths of time. Genesis even summarizes the 6 days of creation as one day, the day that Jehovah God made earth and heaven. Each day in Genesis chapter 1 must have spanned extremely long periods of time. The account's perspective is also important. The writer describes the creative periods as they would have appeared to an observer on the earth. Had someone been there, he would have seen events that started in one period and then progress into the following periods. Light penetrates the atmosphere to reveal alternating day and night. Earth was covered with water, and vapor filled the air. The dense clouds lifted from the waters that covered the earth, forming an expansive sky between them. Water receded to uncover dry ground, and the first plants appeared. The atmosphere cleared further to reveal the sun and the moon. God created living creatures in the sea and flying creatures above. And in the last period, God created land animals and humans.
So we've just been watching part of a video titled "Was the Universe Created?" and probably the more scientifically minded among you will already have been inwardly screaming during that particular clip, but I'm showing you this clip again to give the creationist narrative, specifically the Jehovah's Witness creationist narrative. And I think this video is very useful when it comes to showing how much deception and how much dishonesty and lying is required to shoehorn the Genesis account into something that's remotely respectable from a scientific viewpoint in the 21st century. First of all, we begin with the quote from Genesis 1 verse 1, and let's remember how this was introduced.
Scientists estimate that the universe is 14 billion years old.
Well, scientists also estimate or theorize that life evolved through natural selection, but you're probably not going to listen to them there, are you? Because it goes against what it says in the Bible. So if scientists say something that the organization can sort of get behind, they will use it in their propaganda.
Scientists estimate that the universe is 14 billion years old. This implies that the universe, including Earth, had a beginning. The Bible agrees. Genesis 1:1 reads, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth."
You can see the cup and ball trick that's been played here. It's what might be referred to as God smuggling. Scientists say that the universe had a beginning. The Bible agrees. Look, here's a verse that says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." That's not what scientists say. That is not what science says at all. They've just smuggled God into the equation so that someone whose critical thinking skills aren't that well calibrated could be led to believe, oh, Genesis 1 verse 1 is a scientific statement of fact, when it isn't. And then you get this whole argument about the 6 creative days. I'm going to be coming to this later in our discussion. And again, anyone who knows anything about the natural order will have been screaming inwardly during this description of the creative days. But again, notice how they've had to do all sorts of logical gymnastics to try and make these fit. And the one that they especially push is this idea of, oh, well, Genesis 1 is written from the perspective of someone standing on the earth looking heavenward and seeing things unfold. And they go one step further, or the narrator goes one step further, by essentially rewriting Genesis. So Genesis 1 verse 3, well, we know how Genesis 1 verse 1 goes. Now the earth was formless and desolate, and there was darkness upon the surface of the watery deep. And God's active force was moving about over the surface of the waters. So it's describing a primeval earth covered in ocean. It doesn't say anything about there being any atmosphere. It's just describing essentially a rock in space covered in water. And God said, "Let there be light." Then there was light. After that, God saw that the light was good, and God began to divide the light from the darkness. God called the light day, but the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was a morning, a first day. Notice how the narrator twists these words.
Light penetrates the atmosphere to reveal alternating day and night.
Well, hold on a minute. The verse hasn't said anything about there being an atmosphere. It's again just describing a rock in space covered in water. You're asserting that there was an atmosphere when no such thing is mentioned. And quite frankly, even if we take your interpretation at face value, how can you claim that someone standing on the earth wouldn't know that it was day just because it's cloudy? That's what he's suggesting. Either the sun is there or it isn't, and we all know that the sun predates the earth, not the other way round. The earth wasn't made and then the sun appeared. So either the sun was there or it wasn't. You can't just have God revealing the sun if it was already there to begin with. And you can't have God making it so that the sun penetrates the atmosphere, whereas previously it couldn't penetrate the atmosphere. Viewers, think for yourselves. Think of the stormiest day you can remember, when the sky was absolutely chock full of cloud. You still knew it was day, didn't you? There was still enough sunlight getting through. Despite how thick the atmosphere was, despite how many clouds there were in the atmosphere, there was still enough sunlight getting through for you to be aware of the fact that it was day. So either the sun's there to begin with or it isn't. Clearly the Bible writer is describing the earth being formed and then the sun appearing in the sky. And as we're going to go on in our video, it becomes increasingly apparent that the writer of Genesis thought that the sun, moon and stars were just quote-unquote luminaries. They were just there for illumination. They didn't understand the way the solar system worked. Why would they necessarily? It's obvious when you read the Genesis account from an objective standpoint that the writer is completely illiterate when it comes to science. And there are other examples, which, as I mentioned, I will get to in this video. But isn't it interesting the logical gymnastics that groups like Jehovah's Witnesses have to resort to in order to make the Genesis account sound credible? Anyway, there's one more clip I want to show you, and it's taken from a Caleb and Sophia cartoon.
Jehovah made Jesus first, then the angels. But there was no sun, moon, stars, no earth.
What would that be like?
It would be something like this.
I can't see, Daddy.
Jehovah created the stars, including our sun,
Wow!
and the earth. But it did not look like it does now. In the beginning, there was nothing but one big ocean of water. Until he made land appear. Then he made grass, and trees.
Whoa! Dad, my bear!
Don't worry, my son. I will help you. Here you go.
Thanks, Dad. What about all the animals?
Yes, first he made sea life. And the birds!
Daddy, I'm flying!
And do you know what Jehovah made next?
Whoa!
He made all the animals that live on land.
It's an elephant! Wow.
And then he made people. Jehovah created the earth and everything on it. He made it beautiful, so we can enjoy it.
So yes, this was, again, a Caleb and Sophia JW.org cartoon titled Lesson 9, Jehovah ... created all things. And I don't have too much to say on this because it's essentially just a repeat of what we already heard about the creative days. Again, anyone who understands how the natural order works will have been screaming inwardly during this description. But repetitions aside, I think this is still very useful to show what's at stake here. Because, you know, these are things that are being taught to children. Children deserve to know the truth. They deserve to know the facts, especially when it comes to their education on scientific matters. And when you're going to take an obsolete, unscientific narrative from a holy book and thrust it in a child's face and say, this is unquestioned fact, this is how it really happened. There really was a Garden of Eden, and the Genesis account is a historical narrative. I think that's frankly disgraceful. I think it's using the innocence of childhood to create more recruits into your religion. And that's what Jehovah's Witnesses are obviously in the business of doing. Anyway, again, useful to see these examples of Jehovah's Witnesses, or you could say biblical literalists or Christian fundamentalists, doubling down on things that the Bible says that are obviously unscientific. We can now, I guess, get started with our 40 examples of the Bible getting it wrong on science. And I've tried to group these into areas of science. The first such area that we're going to be discussing is cosmology. And this brings us to the first Bible example on my list. And it's given in the form of a statement that is true, that is scientific, followed by verses that contradict that statement. So statement number one, or example number one, the universe was not made in 6 days. Obviously, the Bible, depending on how you read the Bible, I should perhaps say, contradicts that statement. And perhaps it would be worthwhile revisiting a clip that we just saw.
Were these 6 24-hour days, as many believe? No. The Hebrew word used in the Bible for day can refer to various lengths of time. Genesis even summarizes the 6 days of creation as one day. Each day in Genesis chapter 1 must have spanned extremely long periods of time.
So it's worth mentioning that there are young Earth creationists and there are old Earth creationists. Young Earth creationists, and there are many of them, do believe the Bible's claim that the earth was created, or indeed the universe was created, in 6 literal days. Jehovah's Witnesses, on the other hand, are old earth creationists. They excuse this whole narrative by saying, oh, well, it's not literal 24-hour days. A day could mean any amount of time. A day could be thousands of years. This is what they say. A day could be thousands of years, or periods of thousands of years. And obviously, when we're talking about the age of the earth, we're not talking in terms of periods of thousands of years. We're talking in terms of periods of hundreds of millions of years. In any case, the excuse that Jehovah's Witnesses come up with is, oh, well, just take a look at Genesis 2 verse 4. In the day that Jehovah God made earth and heaven, he's grouping together multiple days as one day. Therefore, a day can mean anything. Therefore, we're going to say that we really don't know how long each of these days were. They were just periods of time of unknown length. The narrative in Genesis chapter 1 is just telling us the order in which these things happened. Now, we're going to come later in our list to proof that even the order is wrong. But as to this claim that we shouldn't read too much into the word day, or we shouldn't interpret Genesis 1 as referring to literal days, I see Genesis 2 verse 4 and I raise jw.org Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11, which makes it very clear that they really did mean literal days. So Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11, remember the Sabbath day to keep it sacred. You are to labor and do all your work for 6 days. But the 7th day is a Sabbath to Jehovah your God. You must not do any work, neither you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your slave man, nor your slave girl. Seems slavery wasn't such a bad thing in the Bible. Nor your domestic animal, nor your foreign resident who is inside your settlements. For in 6 days Jehovah made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he began to rest on the 7th day. That is why Jehovah blessed the Sabbath day and made it sacred. The writer is here literally pointing to the week, to the fact that there are 7 days in a week. And he's saying, well, the reason why you should rest on the 7th day is because God made everything in 6 days and he rested on the 7th day. So you ought to do the same. I can't think of a clearer way of saying, yes, we mean literal days. But obviously, jw.org is just going to skirt past a verse like this because they want to go for a more mainstream approach that's not as laughable in a scientific context as what the likes of Ken Ham and Ray Comfort are spouting out. Anyway, that was example number 1. Example number 2, again, I'm stating these as scientific statements, and then I'm going to give you the verses that contradict them. Stars do burn out, fail, or go missing. The Bible writers seem to think that stars were permanent. Stars would just never disappear. They would always be there. And obviously now we realize that stars aren't just little pricks of light in the sky. They are equivalent to our sun, in many cases many, many times bigger than our sun. And these are gas giants burning away millions of light years away from our Earth, and they have a lifespan. Stars can be born and stars can burn out and go supernova. We know that now. Stars are not permanent. The Bible writers didn't know that, and here's an example in Isaiah 40 verse 26. Lift up your eyes to the heaven and see who has created these things. It is the one who brings out their army by number. He calls them all by name. Because of his vast dynamic energy and his awe-inspiring power, not one of them is missing. And if you compare the King James Version, that last phrase, not one of them is missing, says, not one faileth. So they're saying you're never going to see a star go missing. You're never going to have a star fail. But due to our study of cosmology, we know that stars do fail. Stars do go missing or go supernova. They do disappear. They do die. But the Bible writers didn't know that. So anyway, that was example number 2. Moving on to example number 3. Stars could never fall to the earth. Now, the examples I'm giving here are all prophecies. Daniel chapter 8 verse 10, Matthew 24:29, and Revelation 6:13 that prophetically describe the stars falling from the heavens onto the earth, as though that's something that could actually happen. But again, we know that stars aren't these little pricks of light. They were probably, in their minds, confusing stars with things like meteors and comets. And to a scientifically illiterate person living in ancient times, how would you know the difference, quite frankly, between a comet, a shooting star, a meteor, and those pricks of light that you're seeing carpeting the cosmos? You're going to think they're all the same. Oh, they're the lights, they're the luminaries. But we now know that stars aren't the same as comets or meteors. And if in fact there were to be a star colliding with our planet, it wouldn't just fall on our planet, causing a bit of devastation. The planet would be consumed into this superheated ball of gas. So again, it's just not scientific, is it? I understand it's written in the form of a prophecy. It's not saying that this has happened, but it's saying things like this will happen or could conceivably happen. And what's being predicted, frankly, isn't scientific. Moving on to example number 4. Stars don't determine the outcome of battles or orbit the earth. This was a really interesting one in Judges 5 verse 20, where it says, from heaven the stars fought, from their orbits they fought against Sisera. Now, is it saying that the stars were somehow directly involved in fighting the battle, or is it suggesting that astrology is a thing and it's possible to predict the outcome of battles by consulting the constellations? You will have to decide for yourself. Either way, it's just not scientifically accurate to describe stars as fighting in a human battle, nor is it accurate to suggest that stars somehow orbit the Earth, unless they were somehow predicting the orbital paths of solar systems in a galaxy, but I think that's quite doubtful, don't you? Moving on to example number 5. Jehovah doesn't direct the constellations. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about poetic language in the book of Job, which according to jw.org was written by Moses. So if you consult Job 38 verses 31 to 33, it describes Jehovah as directing the constellations of the heavens. And we obviously know that that's not how it works. The cosmos functions according to laws of physics that we're able to study and learn more about. It doesn't move around according to the whim of a supernatural entity whose existence cannot be proven or studied. Moving on to example number 6. Earth was not made before the sun and stars. Quite obviously, this takes us back to what I was saying earlier about the creative days, or the order of the creative days. And obviously, as I was saying earlier, Jehovah's Witnesses tend to invoke these logical gymnastics by saying, oh, it's all about perspective. It depends what perspective you're considering this from. Sorry, Genesis 1 very clearly describes the earth being formed first, and then the sun and stars being formed later to act as luminaries. That's apparently the function of the moon and stars and sun, to provide light for mankind. Everything is made with man in mind, which we again now know is not a scientific viewpoint. Moving on to example number 7. The moon does not emit light, despite what it says in all of these verses you can see on the screen, all of which, every single one of these verses, describes the moon as emitting visible light, when we all know that's not how it works. The moon simply reflects the light from the sun. It isn't a source of light, or at least visible light, in and of itself. Moving on to example number 8. The sun is not a mere light that can be paused or reversed. And we have here a number of verses that say otherwise. Many of you viewers who have been Jehovah's Witnesses or who come from Christian fundamentalist backgrounds will be familiar with the account in Joshua 10, verses 13 and 14, where Joshua needs more time to do some killing. The sun's going down, there isn't enough light, and he needs to be able to see what he's doing in order to kill more people as part of the jihad that he is waging. And God suspends the sun in the sky just to give him a bit more light. Again, we now know that that's not how the sun works. So we're really supposed to believe that the earth momentarily stopped spinning, so that it appeared that the sun was motionless in the sky. God stopped our planet from spinning in its orbit around the sun just to help influence the outcome of a battle. And there are more examples of this sort of trickery if you check the other examples that I've cited here. Habakkuk basically refers back to Joshua, but there's an interesting example in 2 Kings where a prophet plays a trick that involves the shadow of the sun going backwards, which again would just require absurd celestial phenomena in order to make that a reality. It's unscientific, isn't it? Moving on to example number 9. The heavens do not have foundations or pillars. Now, this relates to the whole idea of the earth having a firmament or canopy. If you read Genesis 1, what's translated in the New World Translation as the expanse of the heavens is elsewhere in other translations described as a firmament or as the dome or vault of the sky, depending on which translation you consult. It seems that the writer of Genesis thought that the heavens were some kind of roof suspended over the earth. And obviously, if it's suspended over the earth, there would need to be a point at which it's anchored to the earth to hold it up. And sure enough, you can find a verse or verses that describe the heavens as having foundations or pillars. And of these two verses, the one that sticks out for me is Job 26, verse 11, remembering what we said earlier about jw.org quoting from Job in support of the idea that the Bible is scientific when it describes the earth hanging upon nothing. Well, here in Job 26, verse 11, it says, "The very pillars of heaven shake. They are stunned by his rebuke." And again, similar language can be found in 2 Samuel 22. So the Bible writers, or the writers of the Old Testament, clearly thought that the heavens was some kind of structure that was supported by pillars. And again, you can, if you want to, say, oh, well, this is just poetic language. This is just a metaphor. Well, why don't you use the same argument when Job's describing the earth hanging upon nothing? Why is it a metaphor when it's embarrassing and a profound scientific fact when it sounds remotely plausible? You can't have it both ways. Anyway, we leave the area of cosmology and we venture now into geology. Example number 10, Earth and its geological features are in motion, but not if you consult 1 Chronicles 16 verse 30, which says the earth is firmly established. It cannot be moved. Now, I was racking my brains thinking, does it mean the Earth as a planet? Because obviously the Earth as a planet is spinning around the sun, and the sun or the solar system is moving in the Milky Way galaxy. There's lots of movement going on when you think of the Earth from a planetary point of view. Or is it referring to the Earth's crust? Well, the Earth's crust is also on the move. There is no fixed point on our planet that is, quote unquote, firmly established, that will never, ever change. Everything's moving. We are sailing on an ocean, a global ocean of molten rock. We know that now, thanks to the study of plate tectonics. But obviously the Bible writers didn't know this. And I've also included in the scriptures the verse there in Psalm 104 verse 8, which says, mountains ascended and valleys descended to the place you established for them. So apparently God established a place for all mountains and all valleys. Well, if God is establishing a place, that means that that place is, well, if it's established, it's permanent. It's always going to be there. But again, thanks to the study of plate tectonics and geology, we understand that where you have a mountain range now, there could be an ocean millions of years from now. Nothing is truly fixed. Everything's on the move. We are on a geologically active planet with a moving crust, and nothing can be taken for granted, either when it comes to the Earth's movement or when it comes to its geological features. So a whole bunch of verses there that fly in the face of our understanding of geology. Now, example number 11, Earth is not disc-shaped. And you'll see there, I'm referring to Isaiah 40, verse 22, which some of you may remember was quoted in one of our earlier clips.
A theory written after the Bible was completed was that the universe emerged from a cosmic egg and that the earth is supported by various creatures. In contrast, about the year 1473 BCE, Moses wrote that the earth is suspended upon nothing. And around the year 732 BCE, the prophet Isaiah wrote that the earth is a circle or sphere. These Bible writers contradicted ideas that were popular at the time.
Did they really? Well, this is again fascinating. I was saying earlier about how dishonest this propaganda is in trying to shoehorn the creationist narrative into something that can be accepted. You heard there that the word for circle used in Isaiah 40 verse 22 can mean sphere.
The prophet Isaiah wrote that the earth is a circle or sphere.
In actual fact, the word used in Isaiah 40 verse 22 is chug, which means circle or disc. Let's read it, shall we? Isaiah 40 verse 22. There is one who dwells above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. He is stretching out the heavens like a fine gauze, which takes us back to what I was saying earlier about this dome or firmament that's apparently suspended above the earth. And he spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Anyway, Isaiah there says the circle or chug of the earth. Again, chug meaning circle or disc shape. Isaiah actually had a better word to describe the shape of the earth, the word being kador or ball. And we know that Isaiah knew about this word because he uses it in the exact same book in Isaiah chapter 22, verse 18, where it says, "He will certainly wrap you up tightly and hurl you like a ball or kador into a wide land. There you will die, and there your glorious chariots will be a disgrace to your master's house." Isaiah got it wrong. If you were taking an exam and the question was, what shape is our planet? And you put circle, disc, you would be marked wrong. The word you need is sphere. And I guess if you put ball, that too would pass. The shape of our planet is not a circle or a disc. This is an unscientific statement, even though jw.org touts this verse as evidence that the Bible is a book of science. Moving on to example number 12, Earth does not have boundaries or ends. But that's not what you would think if you base your view of geology on the verses mentioned here in Job, Psalms, and Isaiah, all of which describe the earth as having boundaries or ends, which I suppose it would need to have if, again, you believe in flat earth theory. There's going to reach a point if you travel far enough where you reach the end or the boundary of the earth. Moving on to verse 13, the earth does not have four corners, but guess what? Isaiah, Ezekiel, and the book of Revelation all say differently. Example number 14, earth is not long or flat like clay under a seal. I'm quoting there Job 11 verse 9 and Job 38 verses 5 and 14. Actually, if you read Job chapters 36 through 38, that's quite an interesting exercise if you're ready to start thinking about the Bible objectively. When you read those chapters on their own terms, it sounds like the ramblings of a madman, or it sounds like someone living in a scientifically illiterate age who is just taking total stabs in the dark about what the natural order is and how it can be described. It gets it wrong time after time after time. And that's why when you actually look at my list, you'll see that I'm frequently referring to Job 36 and 38, or that part of Job, because it's just this rich harvest of total nonsense of claims that are unscientific. Anyway, in Job 38, verse 5, it says, "Who sets its measurements, in case you know, or who stretched a measuring line across it?" If you're going to stretch a measuring line, you're going to have a horizontal line. You're not going to have a circle, are you? You're not going to have anything that can represent in any way, shape or form a three-dimensional object. And then in verse 14 it says, it, that's the earth, is transformed like clay under a seal, and its features stand out like those of a garment. Obviously, if you put clay under a seal, if you press a seal into clay, especially if you're doing it on a table, say, you're going to end up with a flat shape, aren't you? The writers clearly thought that the earth was flat, that it was something that had boundaries or ends. And this view is, we now know, absurd, although there are obviously people who subscribe to flat earth theory, but I would argue the vast majority of these are Bible literalists. They derive their basic suppositions from the very verses that we're reading now. Our next example is example number 15. There is no hypothetical vantage point for viewing the whole earth. And yet, if you read Daniel chapter 4, which describes an immense tree that can be seen by all parts of the earth, or if you read the verse in Matthew chapter 4, verse 8, where the devil tempts Jesus by taking him up an unusually high mountain, and from the top of this unusually high mountain, he could see all of the kingdoms of the earth. Again, you're only going to write that stuff. I understand it's all fantasy, or it's all like prophetic visions, or in the case of Satan and Jesus, it was some kind of vision that he was showing Jesus. I understand all of that. It's just that you're not going to write that if you're thinking of our planet as a sphere, are you? You're only going to write in those terms if you think that the earth is flat, so that if a tree was high enough, it could be seen by all parts of the earth, or if a mountain was high enough, it could observe all nations of the earth. Moving on to example number 16, the earth has no cornerstone, pillars, supports, or foundations, and yet just look at all the verses that say otherwise. Throughout the Bible, the writers had this idea that the earth was some kind of structure that had pillars or foundations or cornerstones. Example number 17, the sea has no permanently fixed boundaries. And yet, in Jeremiah 5, verse 22, it says, "Do you not fear me, declares Jehovah? Should you not tremble before me? It is I who placed the sand as the boundary for the sea." This is going to stop the sea. I'm going to put some sand there. That will stop the sea from venturing any further. A permanent regulation that it cannot pass over. Although its waves toss, they cannot prevail. Although they roar, they still cannot pass beyond it. Again, clearly written by a scientifically illiterate person who thought of the sea as being in its place and unable to proceed any further. As I said earlier about mountains, there are no guarantees that where there is a sea now, there won't be a mountain range millions of years from now. The sea is moving constantly, and one thing we're learning in the era of climate change is that the sea is more than capable of moving over its supposed boundaries, especially in the case of the 2004 tsunami in Asia. How are the survivors of that tsunami supposed to read this verse? Apparently sand is enough to stop the sea from encroaching on the land, and yet look what happened in that particular disaster. We have evidence in our own lifetime that this verse is a load of nonsense, and yet apparently we're supposed to believe that this was inspired by the creator of all things. Example number 18, there are no gates of death. That's right. If you read Job 38 verse 17, among the many things that the writer is suggesting are real features of our planet, among those things you will find this idea that there are gates of death. Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Apparently, if you travel down into the earth, into the earth's crust, you're going to come across some gates. And there you will enter the realm of the dead. Again, we're supposed to take this seriously as having been written by the creator of all things. Example 19, There's no scientific evidence to support a global flood, even though that's exactly what's described in Genesis 6 verse 9 through Genesis 8 verse 19. At some point, I will do a full video explaining or listing in detail the many problems with the flood myth. There are just so many, it's hard to even fit them into one video. One friend of mine who has attempted this and done a pretty good job is Harrison Kother. Please check out this video that he's made on the reasons why the flood of Noah couldn't have happened, doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Again, I won't go into all of the ins and outs in this particular video. Suffice to say, when I was first waking up from my belief in the Bible as being the inerrant word of God, all it took me was to basically go on Wikipedia. I thought, yeah, but did the flood happen, or might it have happened, or is there some basis for believing that the flood happened? If you go on the Wikipedia article on the flood of Noah, you know, that's a good reality check. It's not like the be-all and end-all. It's not the, you know, the total mic drop on the whole thing, but it just helps give you some perspective if you're willing to entertain the idea that you've been duped into thinking that everything that happened in the Bible was a historical fact. It totally happened, even in cases as fanciful as the Noah account. No, I'm sorry, it didn't happen. There's no scientific evidence for there ever being a global flood, and therefore we can safely say that that whole portion of Genesis is unscientific. We move into our next field, which is meteorology, with example number 20. There was never any firmament or canopy above the earth. So this is what I was mentioning earlier. Genesis chapter 1 verses 6 through 8 and Genesis 8 verse 2 give the distinct impression that there was once some kind of firmament or canopy. In fact, Jehovah's Witnesses believe that it may have been the collapse of some layer of water that was in the heavens that caused the flood of Noah, which is why we see it cropping up again in Genesis 8 verse 2, which is in the context of the flood narrative. There's just no basis for believing that there was any kind of canopy or firmament or dome, you know, in the heavens above our planet, supported by pillars at any point in Earth's history. It's an unscientific teaching. Example 21, still on this subject, but worthy of its own heading. The sky is not solid, but that's not what it says in Job 37 verse 18. Again, this crazy portion of the Bible that makes repeated claims about our planet that just simply are ludicrous. It says, can you with him spread out the skies as solid as a metal mirror? Apparently the firmament, the heavens, the dome, the canopy, whatever the hell you want to call it, apparently it was considered to be as solid as a metal mirror. We now know that our atmosphere is not solid. It's made up of gases that protect us and help us breathe. Not that our atmosphere was created with humans in mind, by the way, but that's the benefit that we derive from our atmosphere. It's not solid, though. It's definitely not solid like a mirror, and yet that's not what the Bible writers thought. Moving on to example 22. God doesn't draw up water. This is interesting because another proof text that jw.org invokes in trying to prove that the Bible is a book of science is the description of the water cycle found again in Job 36, 27 and 28. He draws up the drops of water. They condense into rain from his mist. Then the clouds pour it down. They shower down upon mankind. So they point to this and they say, see, it's describing the water cycle. How could the Bible writers have known about the water cycle? Well, just through observation, I guess. Just by seeing the fact that clouds were raining and the rains would form rivers and the rivers would find their way to the sea, hints at some kind of cycle. But notice that part of the cycle is wrong. It doesn't say that the water evaporates into the sky. It says that God draws up the drops of water. If you were taking an exam and the question was, describe the water cycle, and you put, God draws up the water, you would fail. That would be a wrong answer. God is not causing water to go heavenward. It's caused by evaporation. So if we're really supposed to be impressed, this verse should contain some sort of language describing evaporation, which it could easily do if the writers had a clue what they're talking about. But we're talking about the same writer who's just described gates of death, or will soon describe gates of death in this same passage of scripture. So how on earth are they supposed to get it right about the water cycle? Example number 23, God doesn't direct the weather. And yet when you read these examples here in Job 38, it makes it very clear that God is literally directing the rain and the storms and the lightning. He's behind all of that. And if you want to believe that as literally true, and remember, we've already had an example of a verse from Job, God is hanging the earth upon nothing, that is conveniently literally true when it suits the narrative of jw.org. If we're going to believe that it's literally true that God controls the weather, how do we describe people dying in natural disasters that are weather related? Does that mean that we can blame God for those instances? It raises all sorts of theological problems if you're going to pin the weather on God. It's an unscientific claim, but again, exactly the sort of claim you can expect from a backward, scientifically illiterate people. Moving on to example 24, snow and hail isn't stored. It forms and it falls immediately. There are no storehouses where there's just these vast mountains of hail that are ready and waiting for God to chuck it down on earth. Same with the snow. Example 25. Oh, this is a good one. Rainbows did not begin in 2369 BCE. But that's not what it says in Genesis, and indeed, that's not what Jehovah's Witnesses believe. They haven't come up with an alternative, more scientifically acceptable explanation for this. Jehovah's Witnesses and other Bible Christian fundamentalists literally believe that the first rainbows appeared in 2369 BCE as part of a covenant that God made with Noah after the flood. Apparently before that, there was no such thing as a rainbow. God made the rainbows to remind man and to remind himself of this promise he was making, never to annihilate people by means of a global flood again, even though that promise came with an asterisk. I might annihilate them some other way that's actually more grisly. But yes, apparently that's when the first rainbow appeared, if you want to read the Bible literally. Moving into our next field, we have the field of biology. What does the Bible have to say about biology? Example 26, the first man wasn't made 6,000 years ago out of dust. In fact, that is exactly what the Bible says. If you read Genesis 1:27, Genesis 2:7, and Genesis 3:19. But you all knew about that, didn't you? And you'll also be familiar with the example that I'm giving next, example 27. The first woman wasn't made from one of man's ribs. And yet that's another unscientific claim. We know so much now about human origins. We're constantly being bombarded, or at least I'm constantly being bombarded on Twitter with news of archaeological discoveries that completely annihilate the idea that humans have only been around for 6,000 years. We're just constantly finding proof that debunks that claim. And we're also swimming in evidence that humans are the product of evolution by natural selection, that there were earlier models of human from which we originate, and there are earlier types of human, Neanderthals, that branched off from us. There's just so much evidence now debunking this black and white idea that if you'd have been around at a certain point on Earth 6,000 years ago, and you'd have been looking at a certain part of the Garden of Eden, just boom, there are some humans, or there's Adam, because Adam gets created out of the dust. Actually, would you see the dust forming into Adam if you were observing the creation of the first human? This is what you're supposed to believe as a biblical literalist, that if you could go back in time and be at the right point on our planet, you would be able to witness a human being formed by God from thin air. And then if you waited around long enough, you'd see a rib being taken from that man and becoming a woman. That's what you have to believe. It's completely unscientific, but it's in the inerrant Word of God. More facts about biology. The creation of man doesn't predate rain and vegetation. This is an important one. I will remind you of what we saw earlier in the clips that I showed you.
Then he made grass and trees.
So in the Caleb and Sophia cartoon, Caleb's dad says God made the vegetation, he made grass and trees, and then fast forward to creation of animals and what have you, and then God made man. But this actually contradicts, believe it or not, what it says in the Genesis narrative, specifically at Genesis chapter 2, verses 5 through 7. No bush of the field was yet on the earth, and no vegetation of the field had begun sprouting, because Jehovah God had not made it rain on the earth, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. But a mist would go up from the earth, and it watered the entire surface of the ground. And Jehovah God went on to form the man out of dust from the ground, etc. So what it's saying is, when Adam was created, God still hadn't made vegetation, because what's the point of making vegetation when there's no one around to cultivate it? We might as well make humans first and then make the vegetation, because then humans can cultivate the vegetation, because the whole point of vegetation is to make the human experience more satisfying. This is the claim that's being made in Genesis, that there were no bushes or fields or vegetation sprouting at the point when Adam was created. Again, a totally unscientific claim, which incidentally also contradicts the narrative put forth by biblical literalists, at least in the case of jw.org. Moving on to example 29. There were no angel-human hybrid giants, but this is exactly the claim in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, where of course it describes the run-up to the flood of Noah, and it describes the angels getting into relations with women and bringing forth offspring who were these giants, hybrids. Actually, I've listed just one verse here, Genesis 6 verse 4, but if you really want to go down the rabbit hole on this, you can find verses elsewhere in the Old Testament alluding to the Nephilim or descendants of the Nephilim, suggesting in some way that there were still giants around during the events of, say, the conquest of the Promised Land. So again, just an utterly unscientific claim about these freaky giants who were angel-human hybrids. Example number 30, God didn't bring all animal life to one man for naming. I mean, think about it. We're still discovering species today. We are still learning about new species in the 21st century that were previously unknown to mankind. And yet, according to Genesis 2, verses 18 to 20, God was bringing all life forms to Adam and having him name them. It's calling it unscientific is an understatement. But we move on to our next example. Flying creatures did not precede land animals. And this relates to something else that you'll have noticed in the clips that I showed at the beginning of this video.
The atmosphere cleared further to reveal the sun and the moon. God created living creatures in the sea and flying creatures above. And in the last period, God created land animals and humans.
What about all the animals?
Yes, first he made sea life. And the birds!
Daddy, I'm flying!
And do you know what Jehovah made next?
Whoa!
He made all the animals that live on land.
So let's just remind ourselves of the claim that was made in another one of the videos that we saw at the beginning. I don't need to show you the clip, but you'll remember when they're talking about the 6 creative days, they're saying, oh, well, never mind about literal days. We don't have to believe that. We can think of them in terms of periods of time. So you can believe in the Bible and not buy into this idea that they were 6 literal days. Again, I've shown a verse in Exodus that debunks that claim. But they're saying, think in terms about these days in terms of the order. The basic order that it's describing is the order in which life and the universe came to be. Well, that too is nonsense. The 6 literal days part is nonsense, and the order that are described in those days, irrespective of how long they took, is also nonsense, because you cannot have all sea creatures and all flying creatures predating all land animals. And that's exactly what's described in Genesis chapter 1. It says in Genesis 1 verse 22, with that God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and become many, and fill the waters of the sea, and let the flying creatures become many in the earth. And there was evening and there was morning, a 5th day. So we've moved from one day to the next. And then God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, domestic animals and creeping animals, and wild animals of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. Genesis 1 is getting it wrong on biology, because we know that birds evolved from quote-unquote creeping animals. We know that birds evolved from dinosaurs. In fact, birds are dinosaurs, depending on how you want to look at it. We also know that sea mammals evolved from land-dwelling mammals. In fact, when you study the biology of whales, you notice that in many cases they still have their hind limbs on their skeleton. They've just become so surplus to requirements that they're basically not there anymore, or at least they're not visible unless you study the anatomy carefully. But that hints very strongly, doesn't it, at the fact that these creatures evolved from land-dwelling creatures that over long periods of time, over many eons, ventured towards the sea in search of food and found themselves spending more and more time in water, and the offspring that were better suited to the water produced more offspring that were even better suited to the water, and so on and so forth, until you get sea mammals. But the Genesis account has it the wrong way round, because the writers knew nothing about evolution by natural selection. It's simply an unscientific claim to say that sea life and flying creatures predate land-dwelling creatures. It's a wrong thing to say. If you were, again, taking an exam and you put that on an exam paper, you would fail. Example 32, on the same subject really, life evolved through evolution by natural selection. It kind of goes without saying that this is a glaring area in which the Bible is unscientific, most notably in Genesis 1, verses 20 through 25, which describes God directly creating all life forms on the earth. But we now know that evolution is the explanation for the preponderance of life forms. We know that this is an ongoing process, so that life is evolving all around us as we speak. It's not like life is decided upon at one point in history and there can never be any deviation from that. Just the same as when it's talking about mountains always being in one place, or the sea only ever being in one place. The writers of the Bible were scientifically illiterate, and they just assumed that everything they observed would always be the same. But that's not how evolution works. Evolution is a work in progress. Life is constantly adapting depending on the conditions it's forced to operate in by its environment. So an environment will itself dictate which life forms prosper and which life forms die out. And we see clear evidence of this in the fossil record. I realize many of you watching this video will be saying, oh, now he's talking about evolution as though it's a scientific fact. It is a scientific fact. It's also a theory, but so is gravity. Gravity is a theory. We use the word theory in science differently to the way we might use it in ordinary conversation. A theory is something that has been discovered through the scientific process to be happening. And there's just so much evidence of evolution that it's not in any doubt. When you actually bother to research this objectively, you will discover, and I'm talking to you assuming you're a Bible literalist or a creationist, look, evolution is a confirmed scientific process. It's not being debated anymore by the scientific community. The exact nuts and bolts and minutiae of how it works, that's something we're continuing to learn about, but no one can deny anymore. When you look at the volume of evidence, no one can deny that life evolves. But again, the Bible writers didn't know any of this, and it shows in what they were describing. Moving on to our next example, example 33, animals aren't in subjection to humans. I debated about this. Is this a scientific claim to say the animals are subject to humans? Is that not just a subjective thing to say humans have mastery over animals? But for me, it kind of has a scientific ring to it. It's something where the natural order is being described as under the control or influence of a single species. And apart from there being no evidence of this, or no evidence that this is how things should be, it's also a deeply detrimental way of thinking when you look at our planet and the increasing threats to biodiversity, the fact that extinction is being driven at a ridiculous rate through human interference, through people hunting for ivory and this sort of thing. Entire species are being wiped out by us humans. And for me, it all stems from this fallacious idea, which can be found in the Bible, that the animal kingdom is there to service the whims of humans. The animal kingdom is just a tool, a commodity for humans to use as they wish. All living things must be subject to humans. It's an unscientific thing to say. It's an unscientific claim, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's also an incredibly detrimental way of thinking, which is having real world permutations in the 21st century. And this is what you find in the Bible. Moving on to example 34, carnivores did not originate as herbivores. This again, I mean, how did we believe this? You have to believe this still as a Jehovah's Witness. This again is not something where they found a workaround to make it sound a bit more realistic. In Genesis 1 verse 30, it says, "And to every wild animal of the earth, and to every flying creature of the heavens, and to everything moving on the earth in which there is life, I have given all green vegetation for food." And it was so. Jehovah's Witnesses take this so seriously that they say that in the future after Armageddon, when earth is made a paradise, the earth will revert back to the way things were supposed to have been in the Garden of Eden, meaning animals will not eat each other in the coming paradise, because they weren't eating each other in Eden, because it very clearly says that the vegetation was given for animals to eat. They weren't supposed to eat each other. Unscientific claim right there in the Bible. Example number 35, not all animals are terrified of humans. And yet, in Genesis 9 verse 2, again, this is talking about the flood narrative. After they exit the ark, they have the rainbow covenant. There's the first ever rainbow. God promises to tone it down a bit with his genocidal rampages. And in verse 2 of Genesis 9, it says, "A fear of you and a terror of you will continue upon every living creature of the earth, and upon every flying creature of the heavens, upon everything that moves on the ground, and upon all the fish of the sea. They are now given into your hand." This verse is making a scientific claim that all creatures are terrified of humans. And it literally says all. It doesn't say most or a majority. It says all. And it includes all the fish of the sea. So apparently, we don't need to worry about sharks. If we're swimming in the sea and we see a shark fin, we can just comfort ourselves in knowing that we're humans and the shark is going to be terrified of us. So the shark is just going to swim away from us. Same thing if you go walking in the mountains in parts of North America and you encounter a grizzly bear. You can just stand your ground and not have a single care in the world, because the grizzly bear is apparently terrified of you, because God commanded the grizzly bear to be terrified of you, according to this scientific claim in the Bible. We all know it's nonsense, don't we? And yet this is a clearly wrong claim that directly trespasses on science and biology. It's right there in God's inerrant word. Moving on to example 36. This was an interesting one. Snails don't melt as they move along. Even though that's exactly what it says in Psalm 58 verse 8. And this here as well is where people will be saying, oh, Lloyd, this is poetry. It's not meant to be taken literally. Well, it's not very good poetry, is it? I mean, if today someone released a book of poetry and described a snail melting its way across the table, people would be like, melting? The snails don't melt. And yet in Psalm 58 verse 8, it says, may they be like a snail that melts away as it moves along, like a woman's stillborn child who never sees the sun. So yes, apparently that's what snails do. They don't leave a trail of slime that is secreted from glands that aids their metabolism. They're actually melting a bit like candles as they move across a surface. Sorry, unscientific. Moving on to our next example. There's no such thing as a flying, fiery snake. But you wouldn't know that if you based your understanding of nature and biology on Isaiah 30 verse 6. A pronouncement against the beasts of the south, through the land of distress and hardship, of the lion, the roaring lion, of the viper, and the flying, fiery snake. Yes. Apparently, if you travel around the Middle East, you will eventually come across not just a flying snake, and I think we can all sort of imagine snakes that jump, that are able to find inventive ways to get onto their prey, but this is describing a fiery snake. What you mean, like it's a flame, or maybe it breathes fire? It's a fire-breathing snake? Can you be more specific? Now that you've told us that this thing exists, can you please tell us more about the flying fiery snake? We want to know more about it. Where can we find specimens? Yes, unscientific. The writer was clearly just either on something or just writing nonsense, literally just penning down the first thing that came to their minds. Example 38, a human can't survive 3 days in the digestive system of a fish, but try telling that to the writer of Jonah. Obviously, many of you will be familiar with the story of Jonah. In Jonah 1 verse 17, it describes said prophet being swallowed by a fish and emerging 3 days later. He tried to go in the wrong direction. He was told to go to Nineveh to preach that city's destruction. And he instead got on a boat going to Spain, to Tarshish. The boat fell into stormy weather. Jonah ended up getting thrown overboard. A fish swallowed Jonah and for 3 days took Jonah on some kind of weird, slimy submarine voyage in the direction of Nineveh, so that God was essentially dragging him to the assignment he had been doing everything he could to get out of. And this is a story that, again, Jehovah's Witnesses take literally. This is portrayed in a drama that was shown at the, I think, 2018 Be Courageous convention. When they are dramatizing this story, they don't shy away from this part at all.
Do not hold us responsible for innocent blood, since you have done as you pleased, O Jehovah.
They depict Jonah being swallowed, I think, by a whale shark, even though, as I explained in my rebuttal, it's literally impossible to be swallowed by a whale shark because of the configuration of its mouth. There isn't an orifice that's big enough in a whale shark's mouth to allow a human to get into its stomach. It's just anatomically impossible for a whale shark to do that to someone. But even if it wasn't a whale shark, even if it was some other marine life, maybe even a whale, and obviously it doesn't say whale, it says fish, but regardless of whatever marine life you want to say did this, you're not going to have a situation where a human being goes into the digestive system of a fish or whale and doesn't die from, number one, asphyxiation, because there isn't any air down there, and number two, the stomach acids. So he'd start rotting, he or she, whoever gets swallowed by one of these things, regardless of the species, would be eaten away by the acid, and they wouldn't have air to breathe. And yet apparently Jonah survived these conditions for 3 days, so that this fish acted as some kind of makeshift submarine to take him on a journey to Nineveh. Just openly preposterous. And I don't think even the Bible writers wrote this to be taken seriously. This is one of the problems when it comes to scholarship, or the lack of scholarship among Christian fundamentalists and biblical literalists. They just take a text and they assume every word must have been intended by the writers as true. But that's not how these things work. A lot of these stories weren't intended as actual historical narratives. They were intended as stories. And stories give a message. And in this case, it's clearly just a humorous fable describing God messing around with one of his prophets and ultimately showing his prophet who's boss. I don't think even the writers intended this to be taken literally. But if you're going to take it literally, you're clearly embracing a notion or a concept that is profoundly unscientific. We're into our last couple of examples, and we're out of biology and into the field of linguistics, the social sciences. Example 39, human languages didn't originate at the Tower of Babel, but that's exactly what happened according to Genesis 11 verses 5 and 9. God was horrendously jealous that a tower was being constructed that was so high it was entering the heavens, which again entails that God is literally in the heavens and he can be reached, physically reached, if this tower gets high enough. Anyway, he doesn't want the tower to be built, so he confuses the languages. He makes the builders start speaking different languages. And it's from this event that all human language derives. That's not what our study of linguistics shows. Doesn't show that all languages originate in this way. It's an unscientific claim. And our final example, example number 40, this came as a little bit of a surprise to me. I didn't realize this was here when I embarked upon my research for this video. The value of pi is not 3. But that's not what it says in two instances in the Bible, in 1 Kings 7, 23-26, and 2 Chronicles 4, verses 2-5, both of which describe the molten sea at the temple in Jerusalem. Part of the temple facilities, I guess you could say, was this large bowl, ornate bowl that held water that was for use in the sacrifices. And I won't show you the scriptures, but if you look them up, it describes the diameter of the molten sea as being 10 cubits, and it describes the circumference as 30 cubits. But 30 cubits would not be the circumference of a circle with a diameter of 10 cubits, because the value of pi, well, the value of pi, as we know, is an indefinite decimal. It's a decimal figure that goes on indefinitely. But for argument's sake, we can say that pi is 3.14. So an accurate circumference for the molten sea, if the diameter was 10 cubits, would be 31 and a bit cubits. I don't know. It wouldn't be 30, basically. But the Bible writers were here exposing the fact that they didn't understand the laws of mathematics and geometry, and they didn't know pi, basically. And again, if the Bible is the inerrant word of God, if it's inspired by the creator of all things, you would think it would at least get pi right. Anyway, that brings me to the end, finally, of my list. And I might say I didn't start out to do 40. When my patrons asked me to make this video, I thought I'll do 10. 10 will be enough. But as I was researching it, I just ended up going deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole. And soon enough, 10 became 40. And I thought, why the heck not? Let's just do it. Let's do all 40. And probably there are more. Probably if I'd spent longer researching this video, I could have found even more examples. But I think 40 is plenty, quite frankly. Going back to what I was saying earlier, even if you can somehow excuse or explain, I don't know, half of the examples that I've given here, you're still left with a significant number of examples of the inspired word of God getting it wrong on science. And again, the question you need to ask, the question I gave you at the beginning, is what's the minimum acceptable number? How many opportunities are we going to give the creator of all things to get it right in a message from him when it comes to science? For me, even one example of the Bible saying something unscientific would be enough evidence that this is a man-made document. But 40 is plenty. 40 is exactly what you would expect, quite frankly, of a document or series of documents written by illiterate people in a scientifically illiterate age, when they didn't have a clue about these things. They didn't have a clue about biology, geology, cosmology, any of these things. They were simply taking stabs in the dark, making it up as they went along, and getting it wrong time and time again. So that's all I have for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thanks again to my patrons for suggesting it. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.